Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to the Full Court Press Hydrogen Interview series, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Jorg, who is a global lead for hydrogen and CCS at DNV Energy Systems. Welcome, Jorg, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Duala, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, I guess let's start with a question that seems to be addressed by a lot of people who are in this hydrogen space, which is policy, and how there seems to be agreement that the top-down really is the starting point for us to advance the hydrogen story. And if we can focus a bit on the Gulf here, without getting into specifics, but I mean, this region, the energy sector has been heavily regulated traditionally. So if we take as an example, and yet it's a region that's investing heavily in hydrogen, in partnerships with Europe, etc. But just taking that as an example, how important is it that regulation adjusts, if you like, to us using hydrogen towards these decarbonization goals that these countries have?
I certainly think that both the regulations and policy has an instrumental enabling importance. First of all, hydrogen economy will not be sort of unleashed by itself. It needs basically support. There is a market failure in the system today that will need to be addressed, and they will need to be addressed through policy and regulatory systems. That also applies to the Middle East perspective. Right now, you have a lack of regulations that both stimulate the production side of things and also the demand side. And there's also uncertainty in the market today with regards to how hydrogen can be exported and what the requirements will be and how that can be certified. So in general, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, let me take one of those points that you made there, which is demand. And I was going to get onto that, but you've led us nicely onto it, which is the demand security. A lot of the stakeholders in this game would say that we know what the steps that need to be taken are, and there's the money and the investment is ready, to more than the billions that have already been put in. However, we need demand security, we need contractual security, and that isn't there yet. And if you give us a bit of a comparison with how that's going from a European point of view and Gulf point of view. Here in the Gulf, a lot of players are focusing on exporting hydrogen or hydrogen products, but there's also the argument being made that local demand can be enticed. So where are we in that story? Yeah.
No, I think we're just in the beginning there. So I think a key challenge for the hydrogen economy is to be able to scale both production and demand at the same time. In essence, it's much simpler basically to sort of scale the production side of thing, and that's what you're seeing in the world today. There's hundreds of different projects looking at sort of developing production of green hydrogen, etc. But right now you don't really have the large scale demand for that, and it will take time to build the demand. So in order to close the gap between the production and demand, you're seeing some measures being taken. For instance, in the UK, they are looking to enable a 20% blending of hydrogen into the natural gas infrastructure. That regulation is not intended to allow for export of blends to UK, but it's basically a mechanism to ensure that if we're producing basically more than the demand for pure hydrogen, there is an alternative offtake of that hydrogen into the grid. So, and I think also in terms of sort of incentivizing industry to take go in sort of the greener approach, the low-hanging fruits is certainly the areas where you're already using hydrogen, where you can actually start by producing, let's say, green hydrogen at small volumes and using that to replace gray hydrogen. So that is currently being done within, let's say, the ammonia industry, where you're sort of building out certain projects that have that is supplying part of the hydrogen before you sort of take the full-scale investment. So I think those are the types of directions that regulations need to tackle.
Okay, and I mean, is there enough clarity from regulators and policy for investors even, in terms of, I mean, I think I touched on it at the beginning, just the sort of contractual, I suppose that's up to the stakeholders to establish, but again, putting just the demand offtake aside, what about the security for investors on other aspects of investing in the hydrogen model?
You know, you're certainly right. So there's uncertainty on all ends, and I think there's different mechanisms out there. So for the demand side, the type of contracts for difference measures will be critical to ensure that there will be actually buyers for the hydrogen. On the production side, again, the producers need certainty that there will be an offtake, and types of contracts for difference measures will be equally important for them, and we're seeing that today as well. One example here is, for instance, the H2 global mechanism that they're introducing in Germany. So in Germany, they're basically establishing a state-owned entity that will be managing contracts with producers and with buyers. So the intent there is for them to have long-term contracts with the producers. So there will be a competition here, and those that will be able to deliver hydrogen at the lowest price will be getting the contracts. And the same thing on the buyer side. So those that will be able to pay the most for the hydrogen will get the contracts. So there will be long-term contracts for the production, and then they intend to have short-term contracts for the buyers. And then basically the state-owned entity will close the gap and pay sort of the difference there. So I think this is a type of mechanism that would be needed, and we need to provide that type of investor certainty, both for the producers, but also on the users. And in essence, you need to look at the whole value chain in context, also taking into account how they will be transported. Does there exist an infrastructure? Can it be transported by shipping? If you transport by shipping, will you transport it by as a hydrogen or ammonia? And what are the consequences of that, for instance? So you need to look at the full value chain.
Full value chain, and you've described there a nice model that is mostly limited to a national policy, if you like, i.e. how we do distribution, production, distribution, and intake. But of course, we're talking about an international market eventually, and not one size surely can fit all in terms of the speed at which these things develop. So how important is that, or how much of a limitation do you think that will place on the hydrogen sector in terms? I mean, the oil market's simple. It gets into a ship, it's shipped, it gets into a pipeline, it flows, and it's an international product. It sounds like hydrogen isn't so fungible yet from a policy and contractual point of view. So how do you think we'll get there to make, we haven't even agreed on a carbon price internationally. So again, where do you see that going?
No, I think establishing sort of a common worldwide mechanism for incentivizing hydrogen, I don't think is coming in the near term. So you need to look at this a little bit from a national perspective. But of course, if you're, for instance, from the Middle East looking to export to Europe, you need to take into account the competition that you have in Europe. So basically, you will be need to deliver your product to Europe, or to Asia for that matter, at a competitive price. So again, that traces back to the production side. And let's say that you're going to be exporting, let's say, blue hydrogen or blue ammonia. Then first of all, you need to have a market mechanism that allows blue ammonia or blue hydrogen to be competitive with gray. That basically triggers the need for a carbon price. And today we're seeing a carbon price in multiple regions that are at a significant level, and significant enough to certainly incentivize blue ammonia, and in some cases incentivize blue hydrogen. That wouldn't be the case for green necessarily, but that's only on the production side. And in order for the export to come into play, then you need to take into account the sort of that you have for the transport part. If you are in our sort of outlook for the hydrogen future towards 2050, we're seeing that very little hydrogen is traded across regions, even in 2050. But a significant part of ammonia is being traded across regions in 2050. But then you should also think about that if you're trading ammonia, you will not necessarily crack that back to hydrogen, because then it's going to be difficult to compete with the local market. So in essence, you're producing green ammonia, but then that will need to be used as an energy carrier in itself, not necessarily as hydrogen. And I think that's a type of thing that you need to look at from the Middle East. If you're going to be exporting to Europe, You might want to export green ammonia, but then you need to be competitive with local users. If you're going to export hydrogen, then you might need to think in terms of having a pipeline in place. And of course, that's a big investment. And then you need to look at the possibilities of coordinating multiple producers that could be delivering hydrogen along that pipeline.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned pipelines, of course, and infrastructure is a big part of setting up this whole new industry. There's already talk or even examples of some experimental initial examples of hydrogen using or integrating into existing, for example, gas networks from a sort of midstream point of view. There's HSE considerations there, but how quickly do you think that can advance?
So that's a good question. I think that a lot of the pipelines themselves today are capable of taking percentages up to some 20% hydrogen. So even in the UK, I mean, you have tests ongoing, you have demonstrated safety case, and basically there's an agreement that in certain cases, the transmission pipelines can take 20% of hydrogen. Some of the distribution pipes are already ready to take 100% hydrogen. But if you want to go beyond that, then of course there needs to be a consideration to what extent there needs to be retrofits or adjustments to the pipelines, and also, for instance, replacing the compressors. So that is a consideration. DNV is doing a lot of work in this space. So we have a broad joint industry project with some 30 different companies that are looking at what are sort of the considerations that you need to do if you're going to blend hydrogen up to 30% by volume and then also to 100%. We have a big test facility in the UK where we are putting together sort of existing assets from a national gas transmission system to have a flow loop where you can be testing basically 2 and 20 and 100% hydrogen. So there's a lot of knowledge that's being built today. We are seeing some developments where you are in the process of building hydrogen pipelines today, or actually converting existing pipelines. So I think you'll see the first one of those being developed over the next 3 to 4 years. But in the longer term, of course, there needs to be a roadmap behind this. So you need to think about where can you actually replace existing pipelines or actually retrofit existing pipelines, and where do you need to build new pipelines.
And of course, at the end of that is also storage. You know, that's another big area that you're involved in, DNV is involved in terms of storage at the other end, or even locally, wherever that might be. What about scaling, Jorg? That, you know, that at the moment, a lot of the R&D that's gone, you know, into effect, investment has to go beyond sort of the R&D that we're doing and really into being able to scale things faster. There's this argument that we must move faster, we must get bigger faster. Is the sticking point investment, or is it just that, you know, we are still waiting for that technology to come through?
It's a bit of both. So I think it is investment to some case. And if I can take the point about blue hydrogen first, once you get sort of a carbon price in place, that makes it more effective to basically implement CCS for where you do have existing hydrogen production, you can get to scale quite quickly. With the caveat that it takes 5 to 10 years to develop a CCS project. So there's a timeline there, of course, but then you sort of have a clear business case. For green hydrogen, you need to sort of build stepping stones basically to be able to scale to the market or the size that you need. And that is a bit of an investment case. And the sticky point there, I think, is on the offtake side. We've been looking at numerous different, of course, large scale projects. And one of the real challenges is to get the buyers on board with sort of a long-term view to be able to unleash those investments. And I think that's where sort of what we really need is some policy mechanisms that isn't just about doing subsidies here and now within the next couple of years, but giving the predictability over the 10-year time zone or time frame that this is actually a sound investment from a long term as well. And that is where policy really can make a difference.
Yeah, and the carbon price obviously feeds into that as well, how that compares with what price you're going to get for your hydrogen. What if any impact do short-term sort of challenges have on the long-term outlook for hydrogen. You know, at the moment, obviously, in terms of the colors of hydrogen and how those move, a lot of people say it doesn't really matter as long as we're producing cleaner fuel and clean hydrogen than cleaner hydrogen. But of course, we have the gas spike in prices right now in Europe and foreseeable future, and of course that's linked to gray hydrogen. Sorry, blue hydrogen. Yes. Blue hydrogen. So does that having any impact at all on the current thinking around the balance of what type of hydrogen we should be investing more into?
I think so, and it has multiple impacts to the hydrogen economy. So the fact that the gas price is high creates more uncertainty, for instance, around the investment case for blue hydrogen, because it actually, if you look at the gas prices you have today, blue hydrogen is actually more expensive than green hydrogen.
Yeah.
It is, of course, expected that the gas prices will come down, and in the longer term, I mean, it takes, like I said, 5 to 10 years to develop a CCS project. Once you sort of get that off the ground, the gas prices will be lower, and you might sort of be in the case where blue hydrogen is still just half the cost of green hydrogen. So that is the sort of scenario, but there is investment uncertainty on the blue side. It also, of course, impacts the green side in the sense that right now we're sort of strained on energy resources, we're strained on gas. There's discussions about nuclear, whatever, and there's focus also on maybe keeping sort of gas-fired power plants alive. So in all of that, we would like as much as possible of the renewables to sort of feed into the power sector, and to some extent, it's more energy efficient, or it is more energy efficient to use it if it can be used directly as electricity. So it puts strain actually on the accessibility of renewables for hydrogen production. And DNV has also been doing analysis of that, sort of if you do have surplus electricity, what would be your preferred options for using that electricity? And we found that hydrogen is not top of the line there. So there's other options which would be more cost effective to use that electricity. So I think it puts a strain on both of those areas. But with the right policy mechanisms and the regulatory mechanisms, there's possibilities to move in the right direction. And to some extent, that needs to have the flavor of enforcement rather than just sort of voluntary mechanisms. An example of that, again, is in Norway. We have some of the fjords in Norway where there's a requirement that all shipping transport will be zero emission from 2026, and that is enforcing, for instance, cruise ships, that if they want to go into those fjords, they need to have hybrid systems where they can go without diesel within those fjords. So I think it has an element of enforcement as well, but there is always, of course, a balance between having that sort of carrot and stick, sort of to what extent can you leave the decision to the industry to ensure that they do not sort of move to other regions, and to what extent do you need to actually have some of those enforcing mechanisms.
And I mean, how important is things like, you know, clarity on national emissions trading? I mean, we talked about the carbon price, which is linked to that. But again, you know, how far are we away from having a system like that, where if people are going, if stakeholders are going to reduce their emissions by switching to hydrogen, that they're going to get certified that they're going to get rewarded for it, that they're going to have some kind of compensation, if you like, on the other end at some point.
It is really a complex picture, because I think one of the things that are happening right now is that there is a development of certification schemes for low carbon hydrogen, being green or blue or other means of low carbon hydrogen. And that is the intent, that you would be able to trade basically credits for that, or actually have a green premium on your products. If you want to sell steel, then there could be a premium for green steel. If you want to go for aviation, if there's sort of a bioethanol or biokerosene and e-kerosene, then there could be sort of a premium for that as well. But I think the complexity here is it's not really only about sort of the national emission targets that you have. You could have national emission targets in the UAE, in Egypt, in Germany, or in other countries. And if you, for instance, are producing blue hydrogen in the UAE and exporting that to Europe, then you will be contributing to reducing emissions in Europe, but you will actually have an additional emission from that in the UAE. So there needs to be ways to look at this from a both scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 perspective. And once you see that as a totality, then you can find drivers to actually
I mean, you talk about scope 1, 2, and 3, and we mentioned before sort of the value chain, if you like, that feeds into this. What would be, on your, let's say, your top 3 wish list today to push this hydrogen sector forward? What do you think is still missing that needs to be implemented as a start, or even that needs to be pushed faster, realistically speaking? And in that question, are the targets that we're setting for hydrogen short term enough? Are we we all have, the industry has its 2030, 2040, 2050 targets across the board. The timeline for achieving certain things, are they realistic, or should those be shifted somewhat?
Yes, it's certainly popular to have long-term targets for 2050, etc. But at the same time, I think the targets that we're currently setting for 2025 are just as important. What I'm seeing, I think, in many countries is that you start with a strategy, or you start with a sort of more of a long-term targets, but then you're breaking that down into a roadmap, and some of those roadmaps are actually being put into development right now. So I'm seeing a lot of sort of positives in the market. In terms of sort of a wish list, I think that the thing to really unleash a greater hydrogen economy is by creating projects that work. And in order to have that, we need to also have them at scale. Carbon price is, of course, an important thing. So having sort of a uniform, or at least sort of a incentive that is predictable, I think is important. In Europe, you, for instance, have the European Emission Trading Scheme. Right now, it's at quite high level, but it might also come down. I think we've seen other countries that are taking a different approach. I think that, for instance, what you've seen in Canada, where they have a federal carbon tax. Right now, it's $50 per ton. Canadian dollars, but it's going up $15 per year to 2030. So there is predictability that in 2030 it will be $170 per ton. We need some of those mechanisms. I think that is critically important. And then that sense, yeah, the other sort of wish list, I think, is to have tailored policy mechanisms towards the sort of use sector. And I think that needs to be, let's say, differentiated between the different users. So I talked about the contracts for difference. If you're looking at the contracts for difference for the maritime sector, you need to make sure that that is actually making it competitive with diesel. If you're looking for contracts for difference towards the steel sector, you need to make sure that if they are adopting the direct reduced iron approach with green hydrogen, then they can actually compete with the sort of existing production of steel. So that on those two ends, I think it's really important to have that in place. And you asked for 3. So if I can spend my sort of, if I can have all 3, I would, because I think the infrastructure shouldn't be forgotten. That some of that infrastructure needs to be sizable, right? So it's difficult sometimes for companies to take that investment alone. Certainly, buyers will often not take an investment into the pipeline infrastructure. Producers might, but typically then oil and gas companies. If you want export from the Middle East to Europe or to other neighboring countries, there needs to be investment into pipeline. Right now, there is also a big discussion in Norway where we're looking at the export from Norway to Germany. There's been conversations between the Norwegian government and the German government on this. And if you do that, you don't want to build a 12-inch pipeline. You want a big pipeline. Then you need to have certainty that you have enough gas for the next 20, 30 years to be able to fill that pipeline. And you need to have the number of sort of actors in place. So having a government policy to help establish the necessary infrastructure that will enable scale, I think that is critical.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jorg, as global lead for hydrogen and CCS at DNV. Thank you so much today for your insights on the hydrogen story.
Well, thank you for having me.